Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is a bonus episode about depolarizing AI technology.
Sure. I mean, I should start with just for your listeners saying what DepolarizingGPT is.
That's our guest today, Steve McIntosh, a developmental philosopher known for his work on the evolution of consciousness and culture. He's partnered with data scientist and Heterodox Academy fellow David Rosado to create DepolarizingGPT, a tool aimed at fostering more balanced conversations in today's polarized world.
It's a customized chatbot that's built over the top of the platform of ChatGPT that gives 3 answers automatically to every prompt. And one answer is coming from a right-wing perspective, one answer is coming from a left-wing perspective, and then there's a third answer, which we call a depolarizing perspective. It's an integrating perspective. It's not just a centrist perspective. It's not just splitting the difference between left and right. This depolarizing answer attempts to integrate values from across the political spectrum to achieve a kind of a synthesis, or what we might call a win-win-win approach to any political issue. And each one of these answers in the model has been programmed using a whole variety of inputs. So, for example, the left-wing model, we wanted to make it a kind of an expression of what you might call a responsible left. So it's trained on the magazines like The Atlantic or The New Yorker, as well as the thought leaders, people like Bill McKibben or Joseph Stiglitz, right? On the right, the answers have been fine-tuned to be programmed to express what you might call a responsible right, and that includes material from magazines such as The New Republic and City Journal. I mean, not The New Republic, National Review. Sorry, that's a left-wing magazine. National Review is a right-wing magazine, as well as thinkers like Thomas Sowell or Roger Scruton. So it's based on a kind of a intellectual position on both sides, and similarly, the depolarizing versions are based on the philosophy that is expressed by the nonprofit organization that I founded called the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And one of the projects of the Institute for Cultural Evolution is to work on overcoming the hyperpolarization that characterizes especially the Anglophone world. You know, America is hyperpolarized. It's sapping the strength of our democracy. So we've been working to overcome polarization for over 10 years. And our approach is a cultural approach. It's a kind of a cultural approach to a politics that employs this method of values integration that I mentioned, that seeks win-win-win. It works at the level of culture. It's not trying to integrate this kind of flattened typography of left and right. It looks below the surface at these larger cultural structures, these worldviews that include the traditional religious worldviews, progressive, kind of postmodern worldviews, as well as the worldview of modernity, which is kind of in between. So it's not just a polarity between left and right.
So, do you feel like you sort of identified some pretty clear sort of value separations there that allow for these win-win-wins? Because it seems like sometimes even when you have a win-win-win, they still don't like it because it's not the right partisan answer.
Sure. I mean, and there's some people, justice warriors on, all sides of the spectrum for whom anything but, the more religious it is, right, the more you have to say the catechism, right? The more anybody who doesn't believe in the moralized version of their politics is seen as a threatening, apostate or an infidel, right? So obviously overcoming this tendency to moralize political issues in a way that prevents any kind of compromise is part of the approach. But a way of explaining how we get to understanding the values that are underlying the larger culture war, right, which is polarizing our democracy here in the U.S., is by thinking about it in terms of geological strata, right? So you've seen those, those textbooks where they show the surface of the land, and then there's these rock layers below. If we think about that kind of stratigraphy in politics, we might say that the political candidates are on the surface, and that below that is the political parties, and that below that are interests and particular partisan identities. But below that are bedrock values that ultimately animate people's identity and define, what their values are, what it means to live a good life, what a better world looks like. And those values are in the process of developing, right? There's not a lockstep evolution of culture. Culture evolves by steps, by kind of stages of development. And these stages of development we identify as the basic units of culture, which we define as large-scale worldviews, right? And the best example of this is during the Enlightenment. Our European culture had been in basically the worldview of the religious civilization of Christianity for thousands of years. But during the Enlightenment, a new worldview emerged, right? Modernity emerged with Enlightenment values. It wasn't just a matter of Enlightenment philosophy, but even though modernity has been the kind of the cultural center of gravity of the United States since its founding, right? Even though there's still a significant portion of people who identify more in a religious traditional worldview rather than a secular modern worldview, there was a kind of a cultural truce between religious traditionalism and secular modernity throughout most of the history of the United States. But beginning in the 60s, as I analyze in detail in my 2020 book, a third major worldview began to emerge. And over the decades, over the last 60 years or so, this third major worldview, which we dub progressive postmodernism, it can be compared and contrasted to traditionalism and modernity. It's not as historically profound as the modern world, but it acts as a challenge. What makes it its own stage is that it's kind of in a dialectical relationship of thesis and antithesis. It rejects the cultural truce of traditionalism and modernity in a quest for a world that's more sustainable, a world that's more fair. There's many beautiful values that are associated with progressive postmodernism, but there's also pathologies. Each one of these major historically significant sets of values have both dignities and disasters, right? Positive values that our civilization needs because they solve problems we still have, as well as kind of what you might call evolutionary scaffolding or negative pathologies that are directly associated with those very same values. That's kind of what drives cultural evolution, is the overcoming of the previous level's pathologies, breaking out of that, trying to transcend. And as a result of this process of worldview development, our culture's been stretched out so that it no longer coheres as a governable entity. So what we try to do as our method is recognize that there is a way to synthesize the best values of all three major cultural worldviews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because it's kind of a place that I've been in a lot with this show. A lot of times it seems like people feel like if you're trying to, that depolarizing means giving up my values or giving up my stance or, somehow it's somehow giving up some part of me that's important. And it's hard to explain to people that nobody's really asking them to necessarily do that. I mean, yeah, I guess there are people out there that are asking that, but like you're not asking that with this project, right?
No, we're actually not trying to erase or replace the values that people hold dear. We're asking them to consider expanding the scope of what they're able to value. From some perspectives, that's how consciousness itself evolves, is it expands its perception of what's valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can sort of hear my listeners screaming, well, that's not going to work. So I guess maybe I just have that in my head too much, but I hear that kind of thing a lot. And I think, and I'll say there's a similarity here with some other projects that, I've got associated with, I've started to get involved with. There's a lot of efforts out there, as you mentioned, but some of this bridge building and things like that. It seems like a lot of times you see people kind of come to these tools with this idea that I'm going to come in and fix the other guys through this great rhetorical device I'm going to use, right? And what we really find a lot of times with these things is we learn more about ourselves, right? We learn more about, that we can understand the other side better just in and maybe I'll just give a more concrete example. In looking at DepolarizingGPT, I've played around with dropping things in like comments from Facebook and stuff like that people have said. And it's actually really interesting to look at the chatbot's version of what someone on the left would say or what someone on the right would say. And it's interesting that you informed that by saying that this is sort of, I don't know, reasonable. I don't remember the exact word you used, but
responsible.
yeah, responsible folks on the left and right. And it's interesting to watch those because I've learned something from that. Like, oh, that's an interesting perspective. I might not have thought of that myself or whatever. So it almost teaches me something about both myself and maybe more about the other side. And I find that can give you a better perspective of how those two sides look at things. I don't know. I found that to be sort of valuable in it.
Sure. I mean, it's important, I think, to say that in this current time in history, within especially political discourse, it's usually impossible to try to adopt some kind of neutral, unbiased perspective. If you've ever played with a magnet, right, like a magnet in school, and you try to find the middle of the two forces, kind of pulls you to one side or the other. There's no real center in the magnet. Well, that same kind of magnetic energy is keeping any kind of center from holding. I mean, it used to be before this progressive postmodern form of culture gained, significant traction and power in the days of, Walter Cronkite. It was at least conceivable that a journalist could adopt a neutral, unbiased perspective because the culture was largely contained within this agreement structure of modernity. But now that the culture has been stretched out through this development, centrism is no longer viable either from a viewpoint perspective or from a cultural perspective, because all the cultural energy is been moved toward the left. People are seeking for some kind of transcendence. And modernity doesn't offer. I mean, the transcendence offered by modernity is upward mobility, right? And when people are poor or living in tyranny, liberal values are entirely transcendent because they change your condition for the better. But once people have everything that modernity has to offer, more or less, its propositions of transcendence are no longer exciting. So they're seeking transcendence in new ways. They don't want to go back to religious ideals of transcendence. So they're finding transcendence, or at least attempting to find it, in political ideologies, which are a poor substitute for the kind of inclusive transcendence that was once offered by religious worldviews. And so this leads to unforgiving kinds of political militancy that certainly are like pouring gasoline on the fire, right? So instead of trying to say, back to the depolarizing, right? So ChatGPT and the other large language models claim that they have a neutral political position. But my colleague, David Rosada, who is a data scientist who I co-created DepolarizingGPT with, he gained some traction in the culture. There was a New York Times article about him, for example, and that he did research to show that the regular version of ChatGPT was indeed biased to the left, right? And he was able to use a variety of techniques to demonstrate this, but it was pretty clear. And that's understandable because the database that it's trained on is primarily the internet. The internet's primarily created by educated people. Educated people are primarily on the left, right? Not all of them are far left or, postmodern, but nevertheless, it would be impossible to try to. The only way to overcome bias is to show three perspectives at once, right? Not just the two, because then you're left with nothing in the middle, but three that can show what one side looks like, what the other side looks like. So what Rosado did initially, once he found that there was a left-wing bias to ChatGPT, is that he created a custom chatbot that would be the opposite, would be right-wing GPT. And that got the attention of the media. They liked that idea and they gave that a lot of coverage. I saw that coverage. I contacted him and suggested that we might take his right-wing GPT, build it up more, take the left-wing orientation of existing GPT and move it farther to the left, make it more authentically left, and then build an answer that was integrative. If you ask it general questions, the answers are sort of banal, kind of like predictable, not very interesting. What it starts to get more interesting when you ask it more specific questions, and you can begin to tell how it's trying to be responsible on all three sides at the same time that it is trying to go to the answers that it's been programmed for. Which, if you are using this developmental perspective, then you're able to you can metabolize, if you will, the values of all these major worldviews and appreciate the application of these different sets of values to different problematic life conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I like that the depolarizing response will very often, describe, explicitly some of the values why it suggested that answer and what values it holds or represents. And, and again, I think it's probably because I'm just tuned to this so much, sort of watching this space and looking how people interact with things, that it's almost like people almost feel threatened when you point out that this thing I'm suggesting actually follows your values, right? They almost feel like, how dare you catch me up on this thing or something. I don't know. I've even seen people sort of get hostile to those kind of responses, but I guess, what are you going to do?
Well, people have their own individual values, but we all participate in culture and we all have a degree of cultural consciousness, right? Values especially are more intersubjective, right? They exist between people, more than they do, or arise independently subjectively, right? So we're participating in this intersubjective culture, and these value sets, because they provide identity, they engender loyalty, and so it's kind of natural and understandable that people are going to make meaning from within an existing cultural structure or worldview. But the logic of what we're suggesting is simple, right? In the same way that over the last 60 years, this progressive postmodern worldview has gained traction, especially in elite institutions, it's not the end of history. Something comes next, right? That's why one of the ways of phrasing what we're talking about is that there's the worldview of modernity, and then there's the postmodern worldview. What comes next is post-postmodern, if you'll pardon the phrase. It's post-progressive, not in the sense that it's anti-progressive. It tries to include the best and, again, transcend the worst.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to kind of jump back a little bit to something you said before that I think is pretty profound, and my listeners might be going, "When are you going to ask them about that?" So I better ask you about it. Which you were kind of talking about how this transition from modernity to the post progressive stage kind of have left us with a hole from where we used to, would look to religions for some of this guidance, and maybe this relates a little bit to what was found in the 2020 paper, the political sectarianism paper, where they even came up with that language about, we sort of replaced our religion with our politics, right? And that's why they came up with that political sectarianism term, where we're like sects now. We're like religious sects about how we look at our political side. And so, how do we get? How do we deal? How do we fill that hole? I mean, how can you do that? Because, like you say, politics is not a good way to do that. It doesn't really want to be a substitute for religion. So, how do you see us moving past that? Or getting through it, I guess, is better.
Right. Well, that's exactly the subject of the book that I'm working on now, pointing to how we can find new sources of transcendence, if used as an umbrella term to mean, kind of higher purpose or something that some interest that's greater than self-interest that can help us achieve our own self-actualization by serving it, right? And when you begin to look at that, not only is this large-scale structure creating value, but we embody, each human is a microcosmic embodiment, right? From the hydrogen atoms in our water molecules through the kinds of consciousness that we're using right now to have this conversation. This creates a larger structure of emergence, under the understanding of which points to the direction of further emergence, the direction of further evolution, which again, what are the directions of evolution in this realm of human history, in the noosphere, as it's called? And those are the directions of goodness, truth, and beauty. And how can we sort out all the different conceptions of what's beautiful, true, and good? Well, it begins by understanding this evolution of culture more thoroughly and recognizing these worldview stages. They're each sets. They each have different definitions of the good life, but they're nevertheless trying to improve the human condition based on the problematic life conditions that they encounter in their time in history, right? And we don't all live in the same time in history, right? The problems that animated religious worldviews still exist in many parts of the world. The problems that modernity solves are still rampant. The problems that postmodernity solves are also, especially in the developed world, problems that point to the opportunity for further evolution. So there's a lot more to this recovered transcendence, but that gives you a taste of how we can draw a line from what science has revealed about evolution through a philosophical interpretation of the evolution that we represent. I mean, humans are agents of evolution, right? The purpose that's in us is a kind of a little microcosmic reflection of the purpose of the universe overall, and how we can frame the pathologies of progressivism, its destructive quality on the rest of the society, by recognizing that it's a step, right? The famous construct, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is a way of understanding the evolutionary process, right? How it moves, from one step to the next. And so if we look at, the establishment culture that America's enjoyed throughout its history as the thesis, we can see this progressive postmodern worldview as the antithesis. And the antithesis has been emerging for decades now, but since 2020, its pathologies have become much more evident to the larger culture, right? Before it was just seen as some, the left, they weren't as threatening. But now that we see the events of 2020, for example, and the disruptions of anti-racism, I mean, even though there's good things there too, there's also this repudiation of the best that's come before, right? And the vilification of America as a, hopelessly racist society. So that intense, militant anti-modernism begins to demonstrate the pathologies of progressivism in a way that signals the opening to move from the antithesis to the synthesis. Again, not as a society as a whole, but among thinkers and elite people and educated people and journalists and, the clerisy, as they're sometimes called. There's a way beyond just this kind of militant stance of rejection that we see in progressive postmodernism. And so I'm encouraged because I see postmodernism's now on the radar screen. It used to be that liberal and progressive in media discourse were synonymous, but now they can now distinguish between liberals and progressives, at least many of them can, and that semantic distinction signals a larger recognition of the underlying difference between modernity as a worldview and postmodernity as a worldview. So I'm definitely, optimism's like a bet. I would say it has more to do with hope and courage, which are virtues, right? And so I try to practice those virtues, in a way that's also tempered by other virtues like temperance and prudence and wisdom and justice. So again, I'm definitely see the future as being positive, but we may have to go through a further turmoil before we get there. If Trump, as I mentioned, is he's a kind of a phenomenon of this disruption. The traditionalism, the traditional culture, even though they don't have this kind of thinking in terms of their strategy, but they can feel when their culture is being dissolved or otherwise completely dissed. So, Trump is appealing to them, not because he's a particularly attractive character, but because he's a cultural bodyguard, right? He's a tough guy. If you want a bouncer, you're not going to look at their arrest record. You want the toughest guy you can find. And for him, I mean, I think it's a mistake, right, to vote for Trump, but I'm sympathetic to why they're sending somebody like this to represent them. And the 4 more years of Trump could spell all kinds of disaster. I mean, certainly the clerisy wants us to freak out and be very afraid of it. And I think there's good reasons to be afraid. But at the same time, there's also reasons for hope, because even if Trump is elected, there's a good chance that his first term will look similar to his second term will look similar to his first, and that it'll be damaging and embarrassing and hair-pulling, but there'll also be, it won't be an end to America as a country or, civil politics as a practice we can get back to. So, the culture war is not over. It may get worse before it gets better, but ultimately, I have faith in cultural evolution because humans want to make the world a better place. And while we can, get tied up in our underwear around it, we can also see our way clear to evolving beyond it. And the only way to solve the culture war is to effectively grow out of it. And now we're beginning to see plausible scenarios for what that growth might look like.
Yeah, deep stuff. Deep stuff for sure. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Well, thank you very much, Steve McIntosh. I really appreciated that conversation, and I think my audience is going to enjoy it.
My pleasure, David. I look forward to seeing the podcast when it comes out.
Great.
All right.
Well, all right. Well, take care. Bye-bye. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.